My name is Walter Bradley. I'm Chairman Emeritus of the Department of Neurology in the Miller School of Medicine at the University of Miami. In 2018, the waters around Florida were affected by harmful algal blooms, catastrophic events of both red tide and blue-green algae that impacted not just tourism, but also the quality of life of people who lived there and had to be subjected to those harmful algal blooms. Those blooms killed millions upon millions of our marine life. But it wasn't just the marine life that was affected. It also was humans. And the question is, what is going on in our waters and what is causing these health effects? You're going to hear interviews with many different specialists in fields as diverse as epidemiology, algal science, water quality experts, and physicians who deal with all of the problems that can come from these harmful algal blooms. Physicians like emergency room physicians, ear, nose and throat physicians, neurologists, and many others, and including the people who deal with these in the front lines, that is our nurses. So I hope that we're going to be able to show you what are the risks of these harmful algal blooms.
We were born and raised in this area. We've lived here literally our entire lives. Had kids in 2012, and it's been quite a different experience, I think, now with the water, where it really wasn't quite an issue when we were younger.
In the past couple of years, it's been a lot more noticeable. I mean, I've never in my life had allergies or any sort of reactions or environmental or anything like that. And last year, I had just, my face was completely, it was red, it was irritated, I was coughing all the time. We noticed it with the kids as well. So it has changed the fabric of what it's like to live here and to visit here, because you're just worried, you're just afraid, like, yeah. What am I exposing myself to? What am I exposing my kids to? And, you know, it sucks.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Cassani, the Calusa Waterkeeper. Out here on the Calusa River today. This is really the lifeblood, water, heart of our whole system. Last year, 2018, was just a historic year for harmful algal blooms on this particular water body here and the coastal ecosystem as well.
So we get large blooms of blue-green algae down here in Florida Bay, in the Lake Okeechobee, down the Calusa River, down to Pine Island Sound, Fort Myers, Cape Coral area, down the St. Lucie Canal, into the St. Lucie estuary here, and into the southern end of the Indian River Lagoon here. And this is Stewart right there.
So last year was also unusual in the fact that we had the blue-green algal blooms in the Caloosahatchee and in Cape Coral, and we had an intensive red tide bloom out in the ocean. And a lot of people were wondering how connected they were. Are they the same thing? Red tide is an ocean phenomenon, whereas the blue-green algal blooms are freshwater. The microcystis blooms in particular are freshwater phenomena.
Last year was particularly bad in 2018 because the poor people there from, I guess, Sanibel up to Boca Grande and maybe even beyond had the red tide hitting them from the coast and cyanobacteria coming down the Caloosahatchee into Port Charlotte. It was like they're in this neurotoxic vice. And then their animals started dying, and they started shipping their animals up here to us in Jackson Hole. Yes, we found the cyanobacterial toxins in these dog brains. So we're worried. And people say, well, people shouldn't be alarmed. My view is, yeah, I'd be really alarmed. This is no joke.
And what was really important last year was we were learning pretty much for the first time how important inhalation toxicity is to public health risk from cyanobacteria and from red tide.
So we know these algal toxins can get into seafood and can make people sick. What we don't really know yet very much is to what extent these toxins get into the air. Potentially this would be more dangerous because, first of all, with seafood you can just avoid eating it, but you can't avoid breathing the air. The other thing is when you eat these toxins, it gets processed by all the bacteria in your gut first, so a lot of it gets broken down and doesn't ever make it into your bloodstream. Whereas if you have the toxins in the ear, your lungs are very efficient at taking things out of the ear and injecting right into your bloodstream.
We were seeing a tremendous number of patients in the emergency department who had exacerbations of their underlying asthma or worsening of their chronic lung diseases that precipitated visits to the emergency department. And we would have people whose condition might have precipitated a visit to their doctor for some change in their medications, but because of the algae bloom, their conditions got severe enough where they actually had to present acutely to the emergency department.
So this is the actual data from the ER admissions study, where we were querying ER admissions along the lagoon during bloom and non-bloom periods. And some of the results were actually pretty interesting, where you can see enteritis and a few other very specific GI-related admissions actually increased. But the key here, the next step that I need from you is tying in the actual water concentrations.
We are aware of the situation which is going on for last 1 year, and we are heavily engaged with our community about the blue-green algae and red tide. Our board has last year several times they meet, and they were very much concerned about it. Our community engagement is a key here. What we are planning to do, and we have been collaborating with many researchers here. We have in Florida, we are very much engaged with Dr. Mike Parson and Dr. Saunders, who's our infectious disease specialist, is working with him, and we are looking for the sign and symptom that's related to the blue algae red tide. We are working closely with the Department of Health, and all the signs and symptoms they have been asked us to track. We are tracking those signs and symptoms, and hopefully we come up with some kind of criteria for the disease.
Yeah, let me wipe my tears first. To be honest with you, up until Florida started talking about it, I never heard about any of the health conditions in Ohio, or the possibility of the long-term effects. So when my dad got sick, I didn't think anything about it. I just thought it was old age. He was 72, he was getting older, and they diagnosed him with, basically it was like his adrenal system shut down. He had been healthy for so long that I thought we had months or maybe a year. And by June 16th, my dad had passed away. Not less than 30 days later, well, I should say 45 days later, they told us don't drink our water, that we had microcystin that was contaminating our drinking water.
My patients have had major issues with this algae crisis, such as respiratory issues, which include shortness of breath, asthma flare-ups, COPD exacerbations, and these issues have significantly impacted their quality of health.
Of course, one of the first things we would always ask is, have you been, anywhere near the beach or anywhere close to the inland area of the beach where the sea breezes can actually start bringing in some of the irritating toxins that can actually come off of these harmful blooms.
You don't have to go in the water, you don't have to ingest it, but if you're breathing it, if you're breathing the airborne particles, there could be some public health risk. And that is just really blew the top off this issue last year. So your research, Dr. Brand's research, and others that have done it before, Dr. Stummel and others, is really timely stuff. We need that sooner than later. Yeah.
So one of the main challenges with detecting microcystin, or at least measuring, is that we don't have any available or validated diagnostic tests. So an individual can't actually just go to the doctor and say they want their microcystin concentration measured or detected. We need to have reliable exposure assessment before we can even start to talk about what are the health effects, what are the thresholds of concern. All that is very important, but the first step is actually reliably testing some of these toxins in human tissues, so we know how much individuals are exposed.
Last year we had large blooms of cyanobacteria in the Fort Myers Cape Coral area,
right,
on the Calusa Waterkeeper, and then 3 years ago over in the Stewart area, in the St. Lucie estuary.
Yep.
And in both cases, even though people were not swimming or eating the seafood there, they knew about the toxicity of these blooms.
Yep.
Again, people are living next to the water, they can't help it, and they were getting sick. And in some cases it was so bad they had to abandon their homes.
Lived in Cape Coral all of our lives. My family came to Cape Coral to have a boat behind their house and sail and fish and boat year round. And then about July 7th last year, I came home from an appointment and looked out the kitchen window and it was just fluorescent green, and we could smell it in our house. After a few days of smelling that in the house, we felt nauseous and like headaches, and knew that we probably should limit our exposure. And our bodies were telling us something wasn't right. And so that was a weekend, and a family member was out of town, so we ended up leaving our house and staying at a family member's house that was available, because that was easy to do. But I felt that it was important that for my kids' sake, that I limit their exposure and try to stay away from it.
So what we did last year in September and October was we put out these air canisters, and they're basically composed of 7 stages, and they filter smaller and smaller particles the deeper down into the canister you go. And it just works on suction. You have a vacuum pump that just sucks the air into the canister from the atmosphere, and then size fractionates it into these smaller and smaller units. And the smallest unit collects particles that are less than 1 micron in size. And those are the particles that can reach all the way down in the deepest parts of your lungs, all the way down to your air sacs or your alveoli. And that's where you have exchange between the air and your bloodstream. So we left the air samplers out for a month, got the results in, and this was at a residence in Cape Coral where they had an active microcystis bloom in their canal. We measured the same level of toxins at our control site. Our control site was the Vester Field Station, part of Florida Gulf Coast University down in Bonita Springs, away from any cyanobacteria bloom, upwind from the Cape Coral bloom, so we weren't getting a toxic plume reaching down into Bonita. And we measured the same concentrations, both overall in the canister and in that smallest size fraction.
Aerosol, we think, is probably an important exposure route for cyanobacteria, and we've looked at lung tissue and bronchoscopy samples from patients, and it looks like almost all patients have a certain degree of cyanobacteria in their lungs, even in the winter months. And in New England, of course, the lakes are all frozen over up here in the wintertime. So all the water bodies are. So that really begs the question as to whether the cyanobacteria take up residence in the lung tissue, or maybe there are other routes of exposure, like air conditioning systems, cooling towers, heating systems, that we really haven't looked at very carefully. And of course, that route of exposure is well documented with Legionella bacteria, which causes Legionnaire's disease. Air conditioning systems, fountains, pipes in plumbing systems that aren't flushed routinely. With Legionnaire's disease, the exposure can be as far away as 10 kilometers. That's been well documented. And we don't know how far away that could be with a disease like, with exposure to cyanobacteria. But my sense is that probably a mile or more could be an important distance to worry about.
We don't know if you have to be within 10 feet or 2 miles or 5 miles away. We just don't know. We haven't put that part of the puzzle together yet. So that brings a lot of anxiety to people that live relatively near the water. How far away do you have to be to avoid public health risk?
So what we're doing here, in addition to taking field samples of the air where these blooms occur, what I've done here is I've brought the algal blooms in large volumes back to the lab here, and we put them in this wind wave tank. We could alter the wind speeds, the wave types, and so on, and see how under different conditions you generate different amounts of toxins in the air. Now, a lot of biologists do measure the algal toxins, but we biologists we're not that knowledgeable on the chemistry and physics of aerosols. And so luckily, 3 years ago, we hired an atmospheric chemist, Cassie Gaston, and so she's the one who's really doing the details on the aerosol production.
So I specialize in looking at aerosols and specifically at the water-air exchange of aerosols. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to simulate as realistically as we can the production of aerosols from waves and from wind across the surface of this tank here. And then what we do in my lab is we have instrumentation and expertise at looking at the size of the particles that are being generated from the tank. And the reason why that's important is because particle size is really important for determining the health impacts of particles. So when we breathe in these particles, the bigger particles tend to get stuck in our noses, whereas the smaller particles actually penetrate deeper into our respiratory system. And there's also been some evidence that the smallest particles can actually go up the olfactory or the scent nerve and actually be deposited into the brain.
Okay, my name's Dave Myers. Been down here living on my old trawler I bought about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And since I've been on the Calusa Hatchie, I've discovered I might have a little problem. There's a blue-green algae that really hit hard last summer. I've had to go to the VA and they put me on a couple inhalers. One twice in the morning every day. And albuterol, 2 puffs up to 4 times a day as needed. And since the blue-green algae hit, I needed it drastically last summer. And about a week and a half ago, it restarted.
In addition to the direct human health work, we also do a variety of wildlife studies. And one of those is, again, looking at apex predators in the same environments that humans have co-exposures to, right? So, again, animals that swim in the same water, maybe consume some of the same fish species, we're also interested in. And they can actually tell us quite a bit about the algal blooms, the potential toxins that are being uploaded, and provide almost like a sentinel information for our work.
We were testing apex predators, sharks. We found the toxin in shark fin and shark muscle. So that led us to ask the question, if this neurotoxin could be detected in apex predators, can it be detected in the brain? So that led me to start working on the project that we recently published in PLOS in 2019, looking at the dolphin brain. And the interesting findings there is that we've not only detected BMA in the brain at very high levels, at 1.5 times what we've seen in patients with Alzheimer's and ALS, but we also found neurodegenerative changes in their brains.
I primarily am a phytoplankton ecologist. I study the species of algae that live in the water, some of which, as we all know, are quite harmful and can be toxic. This is a submersible underwater microscope that we'll be able to install in the lagoon or in Lake Okeechobee to look directly at the algae cells in the water. And that'll allow us to identify the species that are there, identify if any of them are toxic or potentially toxic, and count how many cells there are, determine their concentrations.
We know that aerosolization is also possible. We've done work with colleagues in New Hampshire, Elijah Stummel and others, and they were taking air filters above lakes that had cyanobacterial blooms, and we detected BMA in those filters. So we know that there is some transmission from the water phase into the air phase, and whether that's through waves or through other actions. And Certainly when I was there, I saw a lot of people jet skiing and water skiing, so that creates sprays as well. So it may be storms, the action of people.
But what we don't know is if that's enough of an exposure
Correct.
to trigger illness.
We do not know that. No.
We just don't know that. One of our real terrific mentors, Dr. Walter Bradley, who behind his back we refer to him as Yoda. I mean, this guy is the top ALS clinician researcher in the world.
We started to do research here in the University of Miami with my colleague Deborah Mash to look at the brains of my patients with ALS and Alzheimer's disease who had died, and we found that there was in fact BMA in the brains of those individuals. Now, the BMA came from cyanobacteria from somewhere, and with Dr. Larry Brand we found that there was cyanobacteria in the waters around the south of Florida. So there came from that the need to see whether in fact there was a frequency of ALS around areas where there is a high concentration of cyanobacteria. And of course, we all know that there have been major blooms of cyanobacteria down here in South Florida. So we looked at South Florida, but I got in collaboration with a colleague in New Hampshire in Dartmouth College, Elijah Stummel, who had been identifying a cluster of ALS patients that occurred in the area around a lake there that had frequent cyanobacterial blooms.
There is a liver toxin called microcystin, which recently was shown, a paper just came out recently, showing that it can affect the blood-brain barrier, which is sort of a protective barrier between the blood and the brain. And it can break that down to a certain degree and cause inflammation in the brain, which is one of the common denominators of neurodegeneration.
As a physician, I am seeing increasing complaints of patients, increasing inquiries in our clinic about the effects of this. People are having increasing symptoms. They're also aware of the media coverage and the links to serious neurological problems such as ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. The answer to that we don't have at this point, and it puts physicians in a terrible position because we don't have all the answers when our patients inquire. We do know that these toxins are related to these neurological problems. We don't know what the concentrations are, what the exposures are, and whether there is a genetic predisposition in certain people to these diseases. So right now we have very dangerous disease, a very dangerous situation, but we do not know the outcome. That is in a position that we as physicians do not like to be.
I'm a big Gulf swimmer. I love to swim. It's my passion. And I swam several times, and I swim underwater and love every second of it. And had a happy weekend, but about 10 days later, suddenly in the morning, I was getting ready to go to work, and my left arm started hurting me greatly. So I asked my daughter to come over for lunch, and when she came over, I said, you know, I don't feel good. I think you need to take me to the emergency room. So she drove me to Gulf Coast Hospital, and by the time I got there, my left arm was totally paralyzed, and my right arm was paralyzed, and I couldn't stand or walk. At first they thought I was a stroke victim, and then they quickly realized it was not a stroke. And I got great care at the hospital, by the way. Gulf Coast Hospital, I had wonderful care. That's not the issue. The issue is, a few days after I was in the hospital, I noticed the news media was saying red tide's coming down from Boca Grande. And that's right where we were, off of Cayo Costa. I told the neurologists, I believed I got it from red tide. The doctors, the nurses, they dismissed me. Really didn't want to talk about it. I pursued it. And not until I was out of the hospital and back for my neurologist check did the neurologist finally agree with me that, yes, you were a victim of red tide.
I have had patients who have come to me in the last year, and they even mentioned that they have gone to their own primary care physicians and they have been blown off by the physicians because they did not believe that their symptoms were related to the algae. And this is not fair to the patient, because they need to be made aware of these risk factors so that they can prevent long-term consequences.
I feel like I have a huge jalapeno in my nose, actually.
Jalapeno?
Yeah, jalapeno. It's maybe funny, but for me, it's burning around this area and here in the throat too. I feel it.
If we know that we have the Carina brevis, if we know we have the cyanobacteria that are around, and if people are reporting that they have actually been exposed, there is a code for that. And it is reimbursable, and it does give a true picture of what's going on, because of course all of these ICD-10 codes, they all go back into reporting agencies, and then it goes into epidemiological studies where they can find out how many times did we have this code pop up in this particular area, and by not coding it appropriately, we're actually doing everybody a disservice.
We have been working on what we call a BPA, Best Practice Alert. This is an electronic medical record aid that helps us identify the patients that have had exposure to the water. And it also helps us collect information or data about those patients so that we can submit that to the Department of Health for further review. The second thing that we have been working on, and it's a major project, is education. Education for our providers, physicians, staff, nursing, and also to our community. So this education, we're planning it later this year, where we hope to provide more insight on what a unique of an issue this is to our community, the water quality.
Tell your providers if you've been exposed, if you're having any kind of problems, if this is a problem that you did not experience before, and now you're experiencing. And if your doctor ignores you, go to another doctor. But these are just, you know, basic recommendations that I have for every patient. If a doctor ignores you, knows your symptoms, you go to somebody else.
I was advised to call the health department to report what happened to me, so I did, and they said, "I'm sorry, we don't keep track of that information. Call Tallahassee Poison Control." So I called Tallahassee Poison Control, and I was told the same thing, that they don't keep track of that information, and the CDC seldom asks them for it. They said maybe a federal doc, when they look at our information in the next year, might flag it because it's an interesting case.
So the Department of Health has an interesting answer when I've come to them asking about other kinds of bacteria in our rivers. They said that the only places where they will post signs that there is a threat to human health is if it's in one of the locations listed on their Healthy Beaches website. Well, people boat and they swim and they recreate in all of our rivers in the state of Florida.
There are two codes that I'd like to bring to everybody's attention. And again, this is in your ICD-10 code set. And it is the T as in Tom 65.82. Now it comes with other extensions. In particular, it would be T65.84A for an initial exposure of somebody that's having symptoms of exposure to a toxic algae bloom. This could be the Carina brevis, or it could be the cyanobacteria. They are listed as one and the same. Now, if you do not have someone with current symptoms, and you suspect that they may have been exposed in the past, say last year, they're still having some unusual symptoms that are, you know, we don't really have all the information. There is also a Z code, which of course the Z code is the, you know, one of the last codes that you would put on a chart. It could be the very last code that you just put in, just for the record, is Z77121, and that is contact or suspected exposure to a toxic algae bloom. That was a fairly new code that was just added in 2018. It's not widely used. However, between these two codes, we should be able to generate enough information for our local citizens that are exposed that we can at least document it and we can track it so that government agencies can then find out how prevalent this is, and then maybe it can help us to start getting this process cleaned up.
So what were the blooms like that you saw this year so far?
Yeah, so a little bit, sometimes different species, the magnitude was different.
This time last year we were nearly at
at peak occurrence for the cyanobacteria bloom. So this year we're pretty good compared to last year. There's been a bloom predicted and actually documented just recently. So we're not sure how dispersed it will be or how visible it will be. If it's in the water column, then it's kind of hard to see. But if it's accumulated at the surface, it should make for some good documentation. Okay.
Whoa! Yeah. Whoa, look how green it is.
Yeah. Yep, we're looking at it. Yeah. It's about a quarter-mile offshore. Yeah, I'm getting some good imagery now. But boy, it's the whole west edge of the lake here has got a bloom. Oh, there's the shot right there. We need to get to the point where we have policy that adequately addresses the public health issue in terms of notification and most importantly in preventing the underlying causes such as nutrient pollution. So those two things is, notification and working on the root cause of the problem is the policy challenges that we have.
So the scientists with whom we are working have done us a fabulous service. They have given us the benefit of their latest research. And I have to say the research is frightening. It's not simply that the beaches are going to be closed as they are in Mississippi or on Lake Erie because of foul smells or dead fish, but that there is a toxin that is produced by the blue-green algae that causes neurological diseases. And it is now up to us, all of us. We have to take what the scientists have told us, and we have to translate that science into public policy. And that means getting the legislature to do its job.
We need a phone number and an app that beachgoers and boaters and swimmers can call when they get sick from anything at the beaches, in the waters, in the canals.
I chose one solution to work on and dedicate the rest of my life to, and that's to protecting our coastal watersheds. But I can't forget that I'm a public health nurse, number one, and that the health of the people of Lee County and the people of the planet really should be a number one priority of our governmental agencies.
My family worries about me, I struggle. My friends, everybody, I think it's crazy. A guy that's capable of making the kind of money I make after having a long career of not making anything and then kind of making it and then doing very well and really prospering, and not only the money, think about how much I love this. I love this. I love this. And, to not go out every day, what it comes down to is there's guys that'll go out and, never skip a beat and don't worry about this kind of stuff. But me, knowing what I have, there's no way that I'm going to explain to him on a deathbed years and years earlier than I should be why I made the decisions I made for money. There's never going to come a time where I have to explain to you that that's what I did, because I'm going to be right here with you.
Harmful algal blooms are increasing in duration and frequency all around the world, but there is still much to learn. In the meantime, what can we do to reduce risk? First, if you see a bloom, avoid it. Don't swim in it. Avoid shellfish. Toxins can bioaccumulate in these filter feeders. Don't let your pets play in affected waters. Blooms can be fatal to dogs. Wear a mask if you have to be near a bloom. If you spot a bloom, report it to FDEP. If you see a dying manatee or dolphin, report that to the FWC Wildlife Alert number. Call the Florida Department of Health Poison Control or the CDC if you experience symptoms from exposure to HABs, harmful algal blooms. If you see your doctor, be sure to let him or her know about the codes to report exposure to toxic algae blooms. All this information is on our website at calusawaterkeeper.org. Most important, stay involved. These beautiful waterways are your waterways. We cannot let these sources of pleasure and recreation degenerate into conduits of disease. It is up to each and every one of us to protect, preserve, and restore them. We owe that to ourselves. We owe that to our community. We owe that to future generations.
We don't want to kill the tourist industry, but we don't want to kill the tourists either.
I would encourage people to be aware of their own actions and how they may contribute to the blooms.
There's a close link between the health of the environment and human health.
So a call for action is to stop these cyanobacterial blooms that produce all these poisons.
Stay away from blue-green algae.
They should care about the water more and vote for the right people so that the people can help our water and not hurt our water.
Because I don't want people to get sick, and I don't want the fish to die.
Let me tell you, dear friends, of the Calusa the river that runs to the sea. Big Sugar denies that they're polluting the skies and the water that flows so free. It used to run clear, surface a mere, a hunter and fisherman stream. Now the seagrass is dead, the wildlife fled, all we can do is drink. Calusa, how the hell you spell your name? 'Cause all this green slime's cloud in my mind, and I'm too drunk to feel the pain. I'm too drunk to feel